Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to discuss how to perfect recoil control on Apex Legends. This is a common question I get asked all the time on stream, and I realize we haven't put a guide or tutorial on it in quite some time. We usually bake it into our guides when we discuss various guns such as a flatline, R301, or R99, but today specifically I want to go in depth. We're going to discuss recoil patterns in Apex Legends, sensitivity in recoil, field of view and recoil, jitter aim and recoil control, micro flicking and smooth aim, recoil and movement, such as utilizing 80-80 spam, enemy movement and jitter aim, light versus heavy versus energy ammo recoil, and of course, to wrap up, we'll talk about visual recoil. Now, during the video, I'm going to highlight other games as well as how they handle recoil, just because it's very educational to help you out in understanding recoil in Apex Legends and why various methods are beneficial. So let's start with recoil patterns in Apex Legends. So I'm going to use the flatline here and shoot the wall. And I already have shot the wall a little bit here, as you can see from the left. Just to kind of highlight there, just to make sure that I'm highlighting that this is the flatline on the other recoil patterns. What we're seeing here is all the recoil patterns, while there is a bit of spread, you notice all I did was kind of hit 2 notches to the right. I'm going to showcase the R301 on the left as well, just to have a better understanding that most guns, while there is a bit of spread, you're going to see a little bit of variance from the recoil pattern, but overall, the overall arc that you see is going to be very, very similar. So let's do that again. Let's shoot the R301 at the wall. And then I'm going to do a little tap to the right, tap, 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 tap. A little too far. Let's go a little bit to the left. There we go. And without moving too far, the wall is getting a little closer, just FYI. So when you're looking at the wall and wondering why the recoil seems like it's up, it's kind of arcing a little further in, just a little bit. But you're going to see that the recoil pattern in general is going to be very, very, very similar across the board. So now let's talk about sensitivity and recoil control. Now, the pros and cons of running a high versus low sensitivity. If you run a higher sensitivity, you'll find that the movement you have to make is going to be much less. If you run a lower sensitivity, you're going to find that the sensitivity you need to run is going to be much more. So if we do 2 examples here, right now I have my sensitivity at 0.41, which is really, really low, just for this exercise. What we're going to do is, let's leave it at 10, just to showcase a really high sensitivity and how little that you actually need to move. This is really, really fast. In fact, I'm overcompensating. Now, let's go back and let's go to an extreme and let us do... Perfect. So now we have 0.1, which is much slower. And you'll notice a sensitivity difference. I 100% tend to move towards the lower spectrum in terms of sensitivity. That's just a personal preference there. But you will see just how little always you have to move your hand and mouse to control recoil. Now, little exercise that I do, just to highlight, is I actually change my ADS per sensitivity. I only do that for my 1x and 2x, and I use 1.25 because I match my hip fire. That's the reason why I had the bigger scope here, so you can see it. This is a 2x, and this is a 4x. So the 2x, you'll see the recoil control there. Now, with the 4x, you'll have a pretty similar experience, but the sensitivity is lower, and you'll notice from my hand how little I'm moving it. And I just kind of shot just so you can see it. Now, when you hit fire, though, you're going to notice that your recoil control is going to be way, way less. So the pros and cons, just to cover them quickly on higher versus lower sensitivity, you already need to move your hand almost next to nothing when controlling recoil. You'll notice, I mean, you can barely see my hand move. I'm looking at the camera up above. It's literally using only my fingers to adjust. This changes, though, when you're shooting targets far away. If you're hitting something from a further distance, you can see I'm going to do the 4x so you can see my hand move. And even then, now let's back up even further. You will notice how little I'm actually moving my hand. And you'll notice the little flick that I do in there to recalibrate and adjust for the recoil control. So the pros and cons as we discuss them. And distance is a variance of how much you feel like you need to move, but still the variance in how much you're actually moving your fingers overall or your wrist is going to be very little. At a higher sensitivity, you're going to need to barely move your hand. It's going to feel like you're barely adjusting much of anything. And the plus side is that it means that you can do more of the jitter aim, where you can micro flick to adjust for recoil. The downside is whenever you do flick, sometimes it can be harder to control, as well as controlling a nice smooth track is easier to do on a lower sensitivity. On a lower sensitivity, the plus side is that it's much easier to control a nice smooth track going back and forth. You can develop this on a higher sensitivity, but just be mindful of the pros and cons of each, and you can move your arm much more to compensate for the recoil. I think this is a nice segue now. What we're going to do next is we're going to talk about field of view and recoil. Now, the interesting part about field of view is that it does not impact your recoil. Think of this as like a camera, like when you're looking at the camera right above me here, is that recoil is going to visually look larger. So if I'm on this field of view here, it'll look like it's bouncing more. Now, if I do the same thing and I go to the opposite spectrum, because the camera zoomed out much more, you see there was still the spike there that you saw from the recoil, but it wasn't as pronounced. So if I shoot at a wall here with this scope that you see, we'll shoot at the wall right here with the low FOV and a high FOV. So I'm going to do the low one, and you'll notice the recoil looks like it's much larger, but it's not. Keep in mind that there's a little bit of drift, and of course the variances that we discussed before, understanding recoil patterns in Apex Legends. I'm going to shoot the wall. Perfect, you saw that recoil pattern there. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go a little notch to the right, and then I'm going to increase the field of view to max. Might have accidentally moved my mouse just a little bit there. And there you go. Remember that I mentioned before that you're going to see some variances when it comes to the recoil pattern. So let's showcase that again, but this time with the flat line, just so you have a bigger understanding of field of view and impacts on recoil. So I'm going to shoot the wall here. Because there's a bit of spread, and spread means within a recoil pattern that is, you're going to see some adjustments. And remember, the wall kind of extends a little over to the right, but this wall is just really nice to shoot at. And there you go. Almost, this is a really great example. I got lucky getting almost pretty much the same recoil pattern there, but this is a great example of sensitivity and sensitivity, FOV, recoil that you're seeing here. The sensitivity is not impacting because I'm not pulling down, and then what you're seeing here is just the field of view that I'm changing. So I'm going from the lowest FOV to the highest FOV. So with that being debunked, what does this mean? What is a great FOV to run? Well, the answer is not necessarily as straightforward or simplistic as one would like. There's pros and cons to both. When you run a lower FOV, so let's do this exercise. When you run a lower FOV, you're going to see less around you. Also, your movement will feel very stifled, and it might feel very claustrophobic. Now, when running a higher FOV, targets will appear smaller, but you also have more peripheral, and your movement will feel a lot more fluid, and it will feel less claustrophobic. So the pros and cons of a high or low FOV. Low FOV will be easier to see targets from further away, and you can see more of that recoil to adjust. Now, the downside of that is whenever you're shooting, is that sometimes you may over flick or overshoot because you think that there's more recoil than there actually is, when the recoil, just as we debunked a second ago, is actually still the same. Now, on a higher FOV, your mind naturally sees something that's moving way less. And because it's moving way less, your mind will already kind of understand, oh, I need to move my hand less. So sometimes running a lower FOV may accidentally cause you to overcompensate for recoil that just is not kicking up as much as you think it is. Now, let's talk about jitter aim and recoil control. This is a very popular topic that has been talked about as of late, but rest assured that this is a topic that has been talked about for a very long time in FPS games. This is not something that you can change or nerf in Apex Legends. This is just pretty much how recoil control works. Now, jitter aim is pretty much if you were to kind of flick back and forth, back and forth, back and forth by compensating for the recoil. I know there's a video, and I don't think I know the distance in terms of recoil here, but if you were to shoot, okay, there it is. Don't necessarily practice that all the time, but if I were to go boom, 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 decent. I can jitter my hand a lot more to be honest. I'm not used to the whole exercise of jittering, but if you were to kind of keep flicking back and forth, and the reason why this works so well on the flatline is because the flatline tends to have a lot more horizontal than vertical recoil. So if I'm constantly just flicking and adjusting, that's more or less jitter aim. I need to do it a lot more pronounced. I personally do not use jitter aim. I prefer to think of the concept as understanding the recoil pattern and then just flicking. And this is and remember, jitter aiming is much easier to do on a higher sensitivity. Now the reason for that is that you're able to constantly flick your hand left and right, or your fingers left and right to compensate for the recoil. That is jitter aim pretty much in a nutshell. My recoil from a distance is not perfect with this, with using the exercise with jitter aim, but if I were to compensate just for just regular recoil, you can feel the tug. You can feel that tug that's occurring. Now let's talk about the concept of why jitter aim does not feel like it works in games like CSGO. Remember that jitter aim, the goal with jittering your hand left and right is that you're trying to get the pattern as condensed down low as humanly possible. So let's highlight the wall. So we see the pattern on the wall, and what we want to do is to get this to mesh into as small of a circle as humanly possible. And when we're shooting, you want all the bullets to be within a general vicinity. These can be much tighter as you can improve your recoil control. This only gets tighter and tighter. And this is why from a distance, and you see that's a much better recoil control. And if you're practicing your recoil control from that far away, shooting a target, I highly recommend it. I don't really use a flatline at that distance, so when you're shooting those targets all the way over here, it'll get much easier to do. And that's something that you can practice, but at that distance, you'll most likely be using a sniper. You'll most likely want to practice your recoil control around the 50 to 100 meter mark if you're going for some distance. And it's best to kind of shoot a target at the wall here, and you can feel the tug, and that's the difference between flicking and then being smooth with your overall recoil control. Now, the reason this doesn't work in games like CSGO is because you always want to focus on first shot accuracy in games like CSGO or Valorant. So an example would be compared to Apex Legends, which has a longer bullet to eliminate time, or TTK, time to kill. You go for one headshot, the target has been eliminated in CSGO or Valorant. That's why wall peeking and holding angles also has a lot of power behind it. Now, the difference in Apex Legends is that you want to keep a consistent through line to consistently get those shots. In CSGO, if you are trying to get that overall pattern and not going for the one tap initially, then you're effectively playing CSGO and Valorant wrong. If you're trying to perfect your recoil control after the fact, remember how long it takes to get into the point of controlling recoil and how much you might already be missing that one tap from across the corner. Now, you can use jitter aim and as well whatever you want to call it to improve your recoil control on CSGO, and you can flick. But most individual pro players always use in CSGO a lower sensitivity to always make sure they can go for that one tap and flick and make sure that they land 100% accuracy on the first shot. Afterwards, they will pull down and they can generally control the recoil, but recoil in CSGO is also very much like a spread, but it's not necessarily as consistent as you see on the wall with Apex Legends. That doesn't mean that it's not predictable and that you can't manage it, but there is a little bit of spread. The spread gets a lot larger the longer that you're controlling the recoil. And if you're controlling the recoil for too long, then your impact in CSGO, as you know, a one tap is going to be the most important thing that you need in the game. So when controlling recoil, specifically, you want to be sure to have a nice fluid movement, or you can adjust and flick, whatever you feel most comfortable with. I tend to flick whenever I see a large variance in the recoil control. And I generally practice around the 50 to 100 meter mark. I even can go back a little further and control it as well, but this is just a personal preference. Now, you can perfect your recoil control from this distance, but remember your engagement and how aggressive you're going to be playing. If you just practice at all ranges, just get used to it, and if you know that you're not always going to be shooting from that distance, then don't stress about it, you know, especially if you tend to play a lot more aggro, or if you tend to use snipers, or whichever gun that you prefer to utilize. They're all going to be beneficial to help improving your overall aim, and that's really how you master recoil, is consistency. Consistency, consistency, consistency is going to be one of the best ways to overall improve your recoil control and accuracy. Now, let's talk about recoil and movement. One thing that really helps with recoil control as we talk about horizontal aim is you can control the recoil just by standing still. But if you move left and right as well on top of it, recoil control can tend to feel a lot more just vertical. If you know, for example, the flat line pulls to the left and you're pulling to the right initially, you will notice that the recoil is already being adjusted for and compensated by you going into one direction or the next. In a way, you can kind of look at 80-80 spam as a way of causing a little bit of jitter aim to helping you out with your recoil. Because then this focuses more on the movement of your vertical rather than your horizontal aim. And it makes recoil control a lot easier. This happens also whenever you're tracking enemies, is that the reason why sometimes jitter aim may not necessarily be for you is that if you're trying to control recoil on a target whenever you're tracking, is that you may find that you're not able to keep as smooth of a track. Because you're not necessarily, you can micro flick or jitter aim whenever you're trying to shoot a target that is moving. And what I'm going to do right now, let's cut to a quick clip. This is from an Overwatch player. I've used this in a video before. It's called micro flicking. I might have a different name for it, and I apologize. I'll put some text over screen if I get the name incorrectly. But what you're going to see is whenever you're tracking that you constantly see like little flicks to track to the target. You'll see micro flicking versus smooth aim, which is very similar to jitter aim and controlling recoil. So I'll segue to that clip. Now, sometimes it's best to find more of a middle ground here of what works for you. Is it going to be constantly flicking when trying to track an enemy target? Or are you going to feel a lot more comfortable with a smoother track? Now, this is all going to depend again, which is why I covered sensitivity earlier, on your sensitivity. At a lower sensitivity, this may be a little bit more difficult to control. At a higher sensitivity, it might be a little bit easier to do micro flicking versus a smooth track. Now, high level, let's talk about all the recoil control that you see from the various guns. When it comes to light weapons, the recoil is initially going to pull up to the right. That happens with pretty much every single gun that you see, is that it pulls up to the right initially. That's the light ammo. Now, with heavy weapons, you'll notice that every single gun pulls initially towards the left. There's the left pull that you see there. Let us grab the Rampage, and you should see a little bit of a tug to the left. There we go, tug to the left. And the same thing, the Hemlock and also burst weapons tend to be some of the odd men out, but overall you can count on the recoil from the heavy guns always pulling to the left, 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 and then light is always going to be right, right. And this is a very consistent basis. So you're going to want to tug to the left to compensate for the right recoil. For the heavy guns, you're going to want to pull to the right to compensate for left recoil. Now, the interesting part when you start utilizing guns such as the Havoc is that you're going to see that there's going to be more horizontal than vertical. There's a massive vertical tug on the Havoc initially, but afterwards, this tends to pull more vertical and tends to sway left and right, left and right, left and right. And there's some variances to, example, the L-Star that tends to pull a little bit to the left. But you can always tend to count on the guns mostly pulling a little bit more horizontal. The Volt specifically is a little bit more vertical. So the energy guns are a little bit less specific than, let's say, the light and heavy guns. Now, let's talk about visual recoil. This one's really important because most guns sometimes can throw you off of what's actually happening versus what is actually going on screen. Specifically the Wingman. And I'm going to remove the sight here just so you can see it. The biggest thing is that it looks like there's a lot of kick to the Wingman, to the recoil that you see. But as you can tell from my hand, I'm not moving my hand. If I were to lift up my hand, you'll notice how this is mostly visual, and most tend to like compensate for this by pulling down too much or flicking left and right, and it can really throw them off. This is mostly visual, as you can see, as I'm shooting in the center and the target did reappear. There's a little bit of variance that kind of happens left and right, just a little bit. There's a little bit of sway, but this is what we call visual recoil at its finest, where a lot of the kick that happens with certain guns is not as much as you think, and this goes away more so whenever you kick up the FOV because it looks like you see less of it. So finding your middle ground with your FOV can be personal preference. I prefer to be around 101. Currently, I also really like to use max FOV as well. It comes down to a preference at the end of the day. And this happens with guns as well, such as the Mastiff. So let's pull out the Mastiff. And whenever you have a sight, the recoil kicks a lot less. It looks like there's a lot of kick to this gun. And I'm going to also remove the sight so you can see it. And I'm going to hold my mouse up in the air. And you'll notice that the shot always stays dead center. So don't overthink your flicks whenever you're shooting with most guns, especially whenever there's a lot of kick to it, because nothing is actually moving or changing as much as you think there is. It's mostly visual to kind of kick up to add some flair to the weapon of choice that you're seeing, but most of the time, you don't have to worry about actually moving your hand whatsoever. So it can be really impressive for somebody to land a lot of shots, yes, but these are more precision weapons that you're seeing here. This is more of a DMR, so it's got barely any kick, but it always does reset back to its center. So don't worry about over flicking for visual recoil. This happens in games such as Call of Duty, where a lot of the recoil in the game happens to be visual versus what's actually happening to the gun itself. So make sure to practice the recoil. Shoot the wall specifically with each of these guns to really improve your overall aim and accuracy. And I promise you, it'll pay off in the long run. Just try to find what works best for you versus it's you jittering your aim. And I apologize if my example, I'm not the best at jitter aiming. I have practiced a lot and more or less on smoothing out my track because I tend to have pretty high in-game anxiety at one point. So jitter aiming just kind of made the whole situation much worse whenever I was first learning this a long time ago. And I found if I relaxed a lot more, that I was able to control my recoil and track a lot smoother than I would be constantly jittering or flicking my shot. Because whenever I'm in game, I tend to jitter a lot more anyways, and if you ever look at my clips, you'll see it whenever I kind of feel a little anxious. So if I'm shooting at this target over here, you'll notice I have a smooth track, but when I'm in game, I tend to have a little bit of jitter, and that's just mostly due to, I guess you can call it anxiety, or whenever the adrenaline kicks in, and whenever it really starts to stress you out. So what we covered here today, just to recap fully here, is we introduce why we're making this video, bringing back perfecting recoil control. Really want to help you guys out with that. Recoil patterns and how every single pattern, for the most part, is the same. There is definitely the spread, and keep in mind the definition of spread is what you saw against the wall, specifically when controlling recoil, and how it spreads out just a little bit. It's not always going to be the exact same, but you have the overlying arc at your disposal. Now, sensitivity and recoil control is also what we discuss in today's video. And to recap, just find something that works best for you. I've put out a lot of videos on high versus low sensitivity, the pros and cons. I know we kind of went high level here, but for recoil, just something to keep in mind always is that the recoil control is always less than what you think. Even at a distance, try not to overthink recoil or pull down too much, and then work your way from there. The biggest tip I can also give is let recoil do the work for you. If you have a really hard time controlling recoil, if you overcompensate, or maybe your sensitivity is low and you have a hard time controlling it, the best advice I can give is always shooting for head level and let the recoil do the work for you. Let's say I barely control the recoil, but I'm shooting around the chest level here, and I pull down just a little bit, and I purposely didn't pull down as much. Let the recoil do the work for you is a great term. So let's say I shoot more at the body level here, and I don't even pull down. Well, this is already dumping more or less the full mag into the enemy player. You don't necessarily have to worry as much if you let the recoil do the work for you. And I pull up my mouse, you'll see how much if I just pull down a little bit, the recoil will do the work and land the shots for you, especially snagging some of those headshots if you're not comfortable being 100% accurate. Because nobody's going to be 100% accurate with the recoil control. Now remember, FOV, find a perfect balance for you. Remember, if you go too low, it'll appear just like it would on a camera that we see, that by zooming in, it'll feel like the recoil is much more. Just be mindful when controlling your recoil that you don't overcompensate for it. And the same thing again, whenever you have a high FOV, that you're still able to see your targets and that you're still able to control and get precision shots that you need with the various weapons that you choose, such as the wingman. Remember the recoil patterns for each of the weapons and where they pull initially. You don't have to memorize the pattern 100%, but the initial tug that you see from a flatliner R301 is very much positive to memorize, because then you'll know how to control the initial burst that comes out of your weapon. And of course, remember, visual recoil, what you're seeing visually is not always what's happening with the specific gun. We've showcased that with the Massive and with the Wingman. Happens less with spray weapons, but remember, don't always believe what is happening on screen, because especially for games like Warzone, it's very specific. We also highlighted jitter aim. What that means, I know that I'm not the most perfect example for it, but hopefully my explanation helps educate you. It's more or less kind of like, you know, you jitter left and right, left and right, left and right. And we talked about micro flicking and how that can also impact. Hopefully you guys all found this video helpful. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And well, I'll see you guys all in the next video.